Good evening, everyone. Welcome to In Conversation. It's a series of museum hosts that explores themes throughout our exhibitions. And this session features interdisciplinary artist Ebony Jemison, senior digital editor for Ebony magazine, Jamilah, Lemieux, Alexander Provan, editor of Triple Canopy, and Michael C. Vazquez, senior editor at Badun. So we're going to turn it over to them and let them start the conversation, and we hope you enjoy and have some questions afterwards because we're going to have a Q&A.
Good evening. My name is Jamilah Lemieux. I am the senior digital editor for Ebony, which means I'm the senior editor for ebony.com. I do not work. Hey, girl. Sorry. I don't work on the magazine, but we are the sister publication to the famed Ebony magazine, which was formed in 1945. I'm sure that most of you are pretty familiar with Ebony, Johnson Publishing Company, and Jet, our other sister publication, which recently became a digital-only property toward the end of last year. I spent a lot of time thinking about the future of Black institutions, mainly because most of the ones that I belong to, love, support, admire, are either in crisis, in danger, or in transition. And though I think most of us with any real sense of history or present have soundly dismissed the idea of a post-racial society or post-racial anything, I do think that there's been a cultural shift away from protecting and serving and needing Black institutions. You know, that sort of cultural loyalty and sense of obligation that were so critical to the success of Ebony and Jet and the first publication which Johnny Johnson, our founder, created, Negro Digest, and some of the other publications that kind of came and went. There's a time where if one of the other publishing houses like Condé Nast or Hearst came up with a magazine, he started one too. There were romance magazines and teen confessions and pretty much every sort of American magazine that existed in this country. Johnson Publishing at least tried it at some point, particularly during the 40s, 50s, and 60s. When I came to the museum a few weeks ago to tour this exhibit, one thing that really struck me, and I anticipated this, was that looking at it, one would not assume that Ebony or Jet still existed. There was no evidence that the magazine had been printed in the last 20, if not 30 years, with the exception of the Beauty of the Week exhibit, which follows at pretty much every Beauty of the Week from the first issue of Jet in which they appeared to the final print issue. That's frightening. I sit in a seat of relative privilege because I am a digital person. My career as a writer and editor has been exclusively online. I've never had any real interest in moving into print full-time, though I have written a few times for both Ebony and Jet and Essence before that. But I think it's something to consider, and especially as we go into this conversation, to really think about what it means. What is the legacy of this company and this brand? What is the relevance? What's the contemporary relevance of Ebony and Jet to America, to African American readers, to people of the diaspora across the world? The influence is clear. It's not a history that can be taken away from us. But where are we going, and are people interested in going with us? I have the very dubious honor, for those of you who read the program book, to be the editor who got into a very somewhat famous role with the Republican National Committee, and to have Priebus write an open letter demanding an apology of my employer after I had a Twitter debate with a noteworthy Republican, and he received that apology. And I think that's something, I really do like how it was treated in the book, which you can find in the gift shop if you haven't had a chance to review it. And it raised a question, because there was so much pushback from our audience, which I could have predicted, but I never apologized. But there was so much pushback from people who may not have engaged with the publications in any meaningful way in many years. But there was still this idea that Ebony and Johnson Publishing Company is supposed to have our back. And they felt that that wasn't necessarily what happened there. And having a deeper understanding of what happened, I don't necessarily think that that's true either. But I think that there's still this very significant cultural, emotional attachment to Ebony and Jet held by people who can't tell you the last time that they've read an issue of Ebony or didn't know the Jet still was in print when it went out of print at the end of last year. You know, one of the most common comments I saw about that on Twitter was, they still made it? You know, and then there were the people who were so heartbroken over it, and then I'd say, well, when was the last time you read it? And, oh man, you know, well, you know, So I do invite you, those of you who do share my personal emotional attachment and belief in the significance of not just Ebony and Jet, but the Black press and the need for Black institutions to revisit or engage with our brands for the first time, because I do think that we're doing meaningful work in print and online. I'm very proud to have been part of the group that relaunched ebony.com in 2012. We did not have a website that mattered at all in any sort of way prior to that, which is dangerous considering that the internet wasn't really a new thing in 2012. But what we have been able to develop and what I've seen copied over and over again by other Black publications online, and I'm proud of it, I'm not insulted, I'm happy, is a pro-LGBT space. We did Black trans trailblazers for Women's History Month. We've done house mothers for Mother's Day. I've been to Ferguson many times. We spent a lot of time covering police brutality. We've had a very pro reproductive health bend online and in print. In print, actually, there was a really fascinating story, I think in the November issue, about sex trafficking. And these are things that Black media hasn't necessarily been talking about, and really, with the exception of police brutality, that we hadn't been taking on in the ways that I believe that we should, with the sort of progressive voice that I think is needed throughout Black media in the maybe 5 to 10 years prior to when we came around in 2012. So all that to say, I don't want to be Debbie Downer and saying, like, I know y'all love Ebony, but when's the last time you read Ebony? But again, I just think it's something to really frame the conversation, that I'd like for you all to fall in love with Ebony again, be it print or online. We're still here, we still exist. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamilah. I don't know can you guys hear me? I don't know if I speak as loudly as she does. Sorry. I feel like you threw down the gauntlet. Now I have to project.
Is it okay to not speak with the microphone?
You can choose not to.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
So thank you everyone for coming. Hi to all of you familiar faces. Can you still hear me if I speak in a normal conversational tone? Not really. Okay, I'll use the microphone. Okay. Now, is this better? Okay, great. So I really appreciated that introduction, Jamilah, and I think you gave us a lot to consider. What I'm going to talk about, at least to start, is a project I made in 2010, which archived earlier African-American periodicals, primarily magazines that predated the emergence of Ebony and Jet in the 40s and 50s. This project, this is an installation image from the New Museum of Contemporary Art, and the project emerged from a set of conversations that kind of came out of a conversation group that I was a part of in Houston, Texas at Project Row Houses in 2010 with an artist colleague of mine, Jamal Cyrus. Jamal and I began a conversation that circled around our shared interest in the rich, messy, critical history and living traditions of literacy among African Americans, especially in the 20th century. And we were thinking particularly about the imminent 100-year anniversary of the Crisis magazine, which was the membership publication of the NAACP, founded in 1911. Beginning as a reading group and think tank, our interest began to crystallize into a project with public implications, and we were invited by the New Museum in 2011 to bring an iteration of our ideas to the museum. We decided to use a quotation and artwork by theorist, sculptor, and painter Ramosi as a starting point. Ramosi used the phrase "Alpha's bet is not over yet" as a rallying cry. His body of work emphasized that the alphabet is merely a, quote, gentleman's agreement, a social contract. And his interest began with the implication that any kind of bet is a promise. The logic of deferral in any promise requires a projection of faith in the face of uncertainty. So he used this metaphor, alpha's bet, to place a system of letters, the alphabet, in a state of suspended animation. For us, this was a really sort of useful starting point for thinking about not only the kind of complicated political history and legacy of literacy in African American context, but also as a kind of way of thinking about the rich and complicated history of the Crisis magazine in particular. Alpha's Bet is not over yet ultimately took shape as an exhibition in the form of a reading room featuring African American periodicals that were independently published between 1904 and 1945, as well as a reading group and a collection of educational and public programs. It was launched at the New Museum in 2011 and continued to the Royal Danish Academy of Fine Art in 2012 and Juxtaposition Arts in Minneapolis in 2014. And this image shows, this is an installation view that shows some of the installation at the New Museum. You can see the periodicals on the left, they kind of wrapped around the room. The exhibition featured photocopies of periodicals rather than their originals themselves, so they were available to be handled, they could be copied. They were organized by issue and also color-coded by date. So there were about 600 reproductions of periodicals included in the exhibition, beginning with early issues of Brown American from 1902, and I think the latest were issues of The Crisis from 1939. Major media and publishing corporations were just beginning to emerge in the early 20th century in America. So you mentioned earlier Condé Nast, you mentioned Hearst. The Hearst Corporation consolidated its empire of newspapers and magazines by the 1920s. Smaller publishers like Harper & Brothers published books as well as multiple magazine titles. As an alternative to large distribution commercial magazines, literary chapbooks and little magazines were published independently, and Michael is going to talk more about that later. But these often served as significant outlets for radical cultural and aesthetic ideas. Some of the black periodicals featured in Alpha's Bet emerged at the same time as and were influenced by the little magazine movement. Like the little magazines, some early 20th century black periodicals were forced to find funding, manage printing and operations, etc., without the resources that mainstream periodicals enjoyed, and some magazines were closely associated with a specific literary style or movement. But there are also important differences. Without newsstand distribution, many black magazines were membership magazines associated with organizations like the National Urban League, Opportunity Magazine, the African Blood Brotherhood for African Liberation and Redemption, the Crusader Magazine, or the NAACP, the Crisis. Others, like the Messenger, were independent. The Messenger was originally associated with a hotel servers organization, a hotel servers union, but after criticizing the union, was forced to be published independently. Some function as the only publications in an entire field of research, like the Negro Music Journal when it was first published, in a way that the little magazines did not. So the stakes were very different. Let's see, what else do I have to say? So as I mentioned in our exhibition, I forgot about my slideshow here. Here you can see a few more of the periodicals, a little bit more of the installation. This is at the launch of the publication that was associated with the exhibition. And here I have my obligatory embarrassing photo of Mike. This photo is from, and then a second one, yes. This photo is from the, to accompany the exhibition, we organized a 50th anniversary celebration for Transition magazine, which Michael will tell you a little bit more about. He was one of the editors, and this is documentation from that event. This is documentation from another installation view from the Royal Danish Academy of Fine Art. And I included copies of these, but I don't think, hopefully we'll have a chance to return to some of those issues later. Yeah, I think that's a good transition to, is that you next?
No, it's
Alex? Okay.
Really good transition to me. Okay. Thanks, everyone. So, as was mentioned, I'm one of the editors of Triple Canopy, which is a magazine that is primarily online, but essentially uses a website as a hub for a variety of activities that we define as publication, even though they might not initially appear as such. Among them are projects we publish online by artists and writers, various kinds of print publications, exhibitions, and public programs. We are based in New York, and we have about 15 editors and designers and technologists of various sorts here and elsewhere, primarily in Los Angeles, and we've existed since 2008. So I suppose, a good reason for me to be here, I suppose, is that Triple Canopy is particularly interested in shifts from print culture to digital culture, as they pertain to how a magazine creates a public, and also how it pertains to the creation and accessibility of archives and of public knowledge, essentially. So we pursue those ideas and also those concrete things in our own way. And then I've also been writing somewhat regularly about these issues, especially related to technology and culture and politics, for a number of years. And I've also worked with Mike at Badoon, which he'll probably say more about. It's a magazine of the art and culture of the Middle East and its diaspora. So I'm also particularly interested in the history of print culture, especially radical and independent magazines of the literary and artistic variety. And those magazines and also alternative spaces for art were some of the primary influences for the foundation of Triple Canopy, as were a number of strange and almost immediately obsolete new media publications, we can call them, which in the last 50 or 75 years have taken the form of boxes containing LPs and foldable paper sculptures, such as Aspen, which is a touchstone for us, as well as in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, DVD magazines, cassette tape magazines, all kinds of endeavors which were basically experiments in media, which at the time, the boundaries of which at the time were unclear. And so they fostered a lot of artistic experimentation and also experiments concerning how information and art is shared and distributed, and how different networks of people are created out of from those forms of distribution, not just in the physical spaces where people actually gather. So Triple Canopy is especially concerned with how we might do such things now when it comes to both like the kind of formal experimentation that can exist in newish digital formats, and also the kinds of audiences and exchanges that can be formed around new technologies, but also the perils of using those technologies and the ways in which attention and behavior are so often and easily commodified. And so, you know, we're not entirely optimistic about the ways in which technology is utilized, but we are attempting to essentially use these technologies to their fullest extent, while also maintaining a critical attitude and incorporating that kind of criticism into our practice. And maybe I'll stop there.
So my name is Michael Vazquez, and I am the senior editor of Badoon. I'm just going to situate myself, which will in some ways situate myself in relationship to the the exhibition here and this event. But so I edit a Middle Eastern art and culture magazine called Badoon that is celebrating its 10th anniversary by not publishing a magazine for a while, among other ways, having parties and also...
Same way we celebrated the 9th anniversary.
Yes, engaging with the archive, which will come up in a second. Before that, though, and actually for 12 years, I edited a journal called Transition, which was out of the then Du Bois Institute at Harvard, now the Hutchins Center at Harvard, but which was a revival of a magazine that had existed throughout most of the 60s in East Africa and throughout much of the 70s in West Africa, and which was the sort of second major literary magazine, sort of like pan-continental and then intercontinental literary magazine to come out of Africa, and which has a very fascinating history, which is one of the things that I am then in turn writing a book about, which is about journals like Transition and Black Orpheus, the first journal, but then also magazines like Mundo Nuevo in Paris, but for Latin America, that were all part of a particular funding network. And so part of what is interesting to me is the way that the relationship between funding and the content that you produce and also the audience that you have, which is also part of the story of Ebony and Jet and Negro Digest, which I love was like Reader's Digest, Negro Digest, and it worked until they were like, actually, people want pictures as much as they want anything. So I'm going to try not to go on too long. So this is Badoon Projects. Badoon does a lot of different kinds of events. This is, I actually had to ask, but I don't know if any of you recognize the shape of the nation that is embedded in the United States in this image. It's Saudi Arabia. So this is something you may recognize the space down on the right because that's the same space that Alpha's Bet's Not Over Yet took place in. Badoon, as a project, organized something called the Badoon Library, which was in some ways even the opposite of. It was the principle of its curation was not that we wanted to find the best or most important books about the Middle East, but that actually we wanted to generate a principle which would buy the books for us. And so and they had to be cheap, and you had to be able to buy them online, and so we would buy them for particular times, and what the idea was that you would get a kind of almost like composite image of the idea of the Middle East by looking at the books that came together, and that it would be a kind of truer picture than if you got the best 100 books that had been written about the Middle East. So these are, and we did an issue about it. This is to sort of, in some ways, mirror the concept behind the exhibition. This was an issue of Badoon dedicated to the theme of library, and every cover of the magazine was different. We basically printed the cover blank, and I think the print run was 4,000, so we actually purchased 4,000 photographs from an antique guy is really strong, actually, from what he was, but from a man in Cairo, from our man in Cairo, which we never saw. We had someone buy 4,000 images, which we then had them send to the printer, which were then pasted onto the magazines and went out into the world as sort of like 4,000 editions, only a few of which we ever saw. I guess we'll see. I'm sorry, my presentation is a little out of order, so we may see a few of those again at the end. But I wanted to show one of the works that I had a sort of connection to that's in the show is Godfrey Doncourt's sort of thing where he makes this connection, which, as you will sort of see, is like a real connection between the Johnson family publications and the journal Drum, which was a South African magazine. It actually, like Ebony, it still exists. It actually has existed almost the entire time since it was founded in 1951, but nobody really talks about it after 1964. So it could be worse. But so Drum was, and this sort of, I think, is the thing that relates to, if I were more theoretical or whatever, I would make more hay out of the word public being part of publication. or the word city being part of citizen. But there's a thing about Drum magazine, and actually about magazines in general, which is that they come into existence to serve urban populations that have to like go to work, even, that are like buying things on kiosks. Like you used to buy magazines in train stations, like that was the main place you would find things. And there is something about Drum in particular, like Drum has a relationship to Ebony, it also has a relationship like self-consciously to the New Negro. And so the movement that many of the writers who are involved in Drum are part of is the New African movement, which is like a sort of thing that is an animating force really until the sort of hope that that any of the actions that people have been taking against apartheid might actually bring the thing to an end. By 1963, it's clear that that's not going to happen anytime soon, and this sort of movement subsides for a time. But so these are issues of Drum. They're colorful. That's also, I think these are colored. I mean, like penciled though, or whatever. But this is another thing that's happening. This is the age also of the magazines that are able to use photography in a new way, like the printing of photography and the printing of color photography. This is what's the magazines. All kinds of magazines are going out of business. There's a lot of churn in the industry at this time, and it's sort of driven by technology as well as by the emergence of the idea of markets, which is also one of the things I found really interesting about, Johnson couldn't get anybody to give him a loan at first, so he had to use his mother's furniture as collateral, but it was like the bank said no. People said there's no market. And it was like, I'm pretty sure. That's Miriam Makeba as the cover girl, along with an expose about reef girls forced into love. Lena Horne. I think that's one of the first issues. Anyway, these are Drum jumps to biggest sale in Africa. This one, I think this is the last of the drums, and this is a sort of segue to the next thing. And I promise I'm actually going to rush through this so that we can just get to talking. But you'll note that this is the Let the People Drink issue. And Let the People Drink is the name of an article inside by Ken Temba. Ken Temba is one of a dozen journalists who are associated with Drum magazine who basically become the first international generation of Black South African writing. And from that period, like from the 60s, which is kind of the moment that globalization of writers' reputations happens, everyone is involved with Drum. Ken Temba is probably one of the best of them, and he died, also like most of them, died way too young, in part because it was a bad place to be a writer, even once you got out. This is, I don't know how this got in here, although this is sort of like color photography being used to sell magazines, actually during World War II. So then this is one of the things that I'm writing about in my book. This is a journal called The Classic. It is edited by Nat Nakasa, who is a drum writer, and also the first black columnist for the Rand Daily Mail, which is like the sort of largest white anti-apartheid liberal-leaning newspaper in South Africa. But you see all of these people who sort of appear in it. It is a result of an encounter between Nat Nakasa and the head of a foundation. And The Classic joins this network of magazines called the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And the Congress for Cultural Freedom supports the publication and distribution of The Classic around the world. Nat Nakasa actually ends up in the United States and commits suicide in New York in 1965, and this is the memorial issue for him. This is a really powerful cover from... Sorry, these are photographs I took when I was in an archive, and I did not have a lot of fun. So this is another part of that network of magazines was Transition, and so these are a few issues of Transition just to give you a sense of what it's doing. Transition is more. This is definitely a little magazine, so it is engaged. Wow, I did the wrong thing. I got it back. Transition is engaged in really in a variety of kind of radical projects, but also the banal project of still trying to sell magazines and actually doing it with more than many of the other magazines in this network. Actually, they had an art director who I think was pretty amazing, and they did, they sort of focus. But anyway, but you can tell that the focus of the magazine, Transition was an extended meditation on the question, trying to answer the question what it means to be African. But it had a particular valence at the beginning because the guy who founded the magazine, the editor, was actually an Indian Ugandan, and who believed he was as African as the next guy, and the government would later disabuse him of that in a particular fashion, which is part of the story of Transition. This is a really amazing cover. Anyway, these are just some images of Transition, and we can segue now perhaps into conversation. Which?
Going to begin?
Well, I was going to begin because I thought we could just talk a little bit about if we've seen a lot of different ideas about what it means to be a magazine. I thought we could maybe talk about the question of like, what is a magazine? What makes a magazine different or the same as other ways of organizing content? One of the things I think that Triple Canopy does, but that actually like a lot of little magazines do and has been a problem all along, is like, how do you integrate art and text? What's like, this is where design actually ends up being the sort of like Holy Ghost that does something else, but the sort of question of like what art is going to do in a magazine is complicated, and it seems to be like a big part of one problem that you try to solve. But then there's a related thing, especially in this day and age, of like, what's the difference between an editor and a curator? Because there's something curatorial about, I mean, there's a lot that's curatorial about what an editor does, but then there's still something elusive or different about the exhibition and the catalog versus the magazine. So I wanted to really just get a lot of interrelated things out there and see what you think.
Actually, can I turn that to you and ask, when you started at ebony.com, like, what was the brief given to you, or how? I mean, just because that's, I imagine you took a job and someone kind of described to you what the definition of that work might be in this context in which these lines are, for many people, very unclear.
So when we came together in October of 2011 with the charge of relaunching the website, there was myself, basically the core team at that point. There were three of us. Kieran Mayo, who I'm sure some of you are familiar with, she's one of the two editors who founded Honey Magazine back in the day. I think it was 1987, which was very much a game changer in the world of publications for young African American women. She came in as editorial director, and she was charged with hiring a very small staff, 2 editors, a few producers, and a production manager. There was myself and another editor whose name I don't think will ever be associated with the brand in any meaningful way, so I won't drag her through this. But we sat, that was shade. We sat down, we had a lot of conversations about what sort of things we wanted to borrow or share from the magazine. In its contemporary context, at that point, Amy Dubois Barnett was the editor-in-chief, and she's responsible for the current look and feel of Ebony magazine. She came in and really breathed new life into the brand. People, including myself, really hadn't thought about Ebony very much in, after the 90s, I'd say. I think the 90s is the point where one could really argue that the quality of the magazine, in addition to the creation of the internet, really shifted audiences, younger audiences in particular, young professionals, away from the brand, and didn't really fail to bring in that new group of folks who are getting their first magazine subscriptions. And there wasn't that cultural responsibility that no matter what I do, I have to have my $10 a year for Ebony and my $12 a year to get Jet every week. So without that, the magazine existed. We are still now the highest, we have the highest circulation of any other African American themed magazine. We are the largest African American owned magazine, and we have one of the highest circulation rates of all the American magazines. I forget the exact number. I don't want to throw one out there and be wrong, but
it's like 1.3 million.
It's high. It might be closer to 1.2 now, but it's significant, especially considering what magazines are doing now, and the number of magazines that we've seen that one would think of as being bigger than Ebony that have gone out of print in recent years. So we sat down and talked about what we liked about the print magazine, what we didn't like about it, and how could we give our readers a magazine experience 5 days a week, because we rarely generate content on weekends without, it's hard. So we're dealing with things in real time. So Zimmerman verdict comes back, we're reacting now, so we don't have the luxury of time that a print magazine does, but at the same time we don't have the constraints that print does. That was something that was really just the difference in what we do was really highlighted for me with all the events in Ferguson and how they were not really able to take on that first wave of protests and the death of Michael Brown in a meaningful way, in my opinion. I actually wrote the story, but that they weren't, what print was able to do with it versus what we were able to do with it were two very different things. So Ebony has always been a lifestyle publication. There are some people who think that we're a women's magazine, largely because there's another African American magazine that starts with an E, and also because we tend to have women on our covers a lot, which is difficult because there's only but a handful of, there are but so many African American celebrities that you can shoot month after month. And when the beauty brands buy ads, and the men's themed companies or the advertisers that are looking for African American men would prefer to go to a hip hop magazine or try to just get them somehow through GQ or Maxim, then we end up having to put women on the cover. It's tricky and it's difficult. And I know so much more about this process than I ever really wanted to know because, it's not very pretty on the inside. But as a lifestyle publication, Ebony always had this feature called Day with a Dish, which was recipes. And back when the old Johnson Publishing Company building existed at 820 South Michigan Avenue, it was the first large office building built in downtown Chicago, which is a very fancy part of town, by any African American business person. Probably the only one that's ever been built there. And unfortunately, we don't own it anymore. There were many things in this building, but among them was the kitchen. So every month there was a woman who made recipes for the magazine. She was taking pictures of this food, and some of it looked really great, and some of it was that kind of weird, like gelatin casserole stuff that you see in magazines from the 50s and 60s. But we wanted to have that, so we'd have drink recipes and healthy eating and workout tips. But we'd also have parenting advice. And we've had a few very provocative sex columnists writing for us, including my now colleague, Miles Marshall Lewis, who's our arts and culture editor, who had a column called Common Sensual when we first started, and he wrote about his romantic escapades prior to becoming, a married dad, and some of his exciting adventures as a young hot writer in New York City. So it's, when you are we're not the only Black magazine, and we're certainly not the only Black website, but I think more than anyone else, Ebony has the gift and the curse of feeling like we're for everyone in the community. So that's Black people between the ages of 18 and down. And I think that's the same thing I've seen Essence struggle with, just Black women. And that's a large, diverse group. There are your church-going, Tyler Perry patronizing, T.D. Jakes worshiping Southerners, and then you have your very sophisticated, kind of uppity Northerners who also patronize Tyler Perry. And then you have them, So there's a lot of us. And then there are people who are like, stop putting him on the cover of the magazine, he's an embarrassment, we hate him. And somehow we really do want to try to reach all those people. And there's been a lot of back and forth tension between print and digital, because there's a conversation of alienating print's base. Mm-hmm. They messed around and hired a bunch of really feminist, really progressive digital editors, and we're competing with the people who are like, I'm pretty sure all of our readers are in South Carolina, and if you all keep doing this stuff, we're not going to have them anymore. So for us, it's about creating an experience. Magazine editors, as I've been able to observe from afar, the magazine editors for our magazine are also working to curate an experience month after month. And they're very big on having themed magazines, and I don't know, I think that's something that you would, when we spoke prior to the panel, you talked about that a little bit. I don't necessarily think that, I think that really taking the theme approach to making print magazines works better than a lot of the things that can do. I don't know, for me, it's just considering that you can't be timely in print. Like, if you're saying this is the topic, this is the subject, this is what we're dealing with, as opposed to we're dealing with what's happening right now, I feel like that's when Ebony succeeds. And when they attempt to be timely is when they fail. on the print side.
Steffani pulled up a recent media kit for Ebony, which had an interesting term in it called psychographic instead of a demographic, and it was making an argument that our readership isn't defined by these narrowly defined demographics. In fact, we as a magazine are able to transcend those demographics because we have what's called a psychographic, which was described as like a mindset that exceeds any demographic, which I thought was interesting. It's a word I'd never heard before.
Just one quick thing about that. One word that's used a lot, I know, when talking to advertisers in relation to Ebony is aspirational. Ebony has, I guess, for some time been considered aspirational. So very middle class. You know, if you are a middle class person, these are the things that you should or want, should or will have. And if you're not middle class, this is what you hope to be someday. Whereas Jet was a little bit more finding people where they are. So more working class in terms of some of the things that were talked about, some of the things that were advertised, some of the celebrities who were profiled. Not as glossy as Ebony, which is interesting because at one point Jet was kind of like, before there was such thing as aggregation. So this horrible thing we do on the internet where we just take everybody else's stories and put them on our site and link back to them, which I think is a horrible practice, but unfortunately we all do it. There are certain publications that have aggregated so much of my work, I want to ask them for a check. But Jet was doing that in certain ways, and Negro Digest was as well, because if you lived in Chicago, you couldn't get the St. Louis American. If you lived in St. Louis, you couldn't get Chicago Defender. So they were pulling news stories from African American publications across the country together, either by actually taking the story or, doing a write around so that people could stay abreast of what was going on, because there was no MSNBC or CNN back then to see what was happening with other communities.
I mean, I was just going to say, Mike, in response to your question, that the magazine experience, as defined by Ebony and Jet, as pictured in so many of these artworks, seems rather fraught, in part because of the relationship between the editorial content and the advertising, which you put those two things together and you have art direction, but of course, the tension between those is quite evident, and I think provides the prompt for many of these works.
Or, yeah, I mean, sometimes it's the tension, but sometimes it's just the advertisements. I think that when you look at early issues of Ebony, in particular, there were so many advertisements, and many of them were for products that had never been directly marketed to African Americans before. When last night I had like a crash, like a last-minute conversation with my grandmother to try and learn everything that she had to say about Ebony and Jet, her experience with the magazines as a person living in Chicago. She moved to Chicago in 1949, and one of the things that she mentioned was that what was really kind of revelatory for her about Ebony specifically was the advertisements, which were for products that she never really considered buying, or she had never been addressed as a consumer in that way, and that was sort of transformational. She had mentioned, in particular, that as a major distinction also between Ebony and Jet relying exclusively on sales and both on kind of not newsstand sales, because newsstands weren't initially very interested in distributing Ebony and Jet, but actually selling them on the subway. My father also said that it was sold for 15 cents, and he remembered. He remembered buying it on the street when there was a special edition or when something important had happened. But that those sales entirely supported the production of the magazine, and that then within it you had only the editorial content or the aggregated content. Whereas Ebony, on the other hand, was composed almost entirely of advertisements with relatively little editorial content.
Johnson said in that early period that it was fat with ads, which is like, I think he was surprised.
Yeah, I mean, and it's kind of amazing looking at I was flipping through one of the earliest issues that is on Google Books from 1959, and the ads were for everything from gin to more brands of cigarettes than I even knew existed ever. That some of the, and it's funny because the magazine appears to have been, I mean, it seems as though it was mostly black and white with some color inserts, but those color inserts were often advertiser driven or just advertisements, and many of those were for alcohol. And there are a lot of advertisements for feminine products, tampons, I was kind of surprised by, suppositories, razors that avoid razor bumps, really, just a really, really wide range of things. Ketchup, like, you know, consumer products that people don't really necessarily make at home, and that those formed a real, they were kind of the foundation of the magazine, and the editorial content kind of like peeked out from in between those. And right.
It was such an unique opportunity for advertisers to demonstrate their interest in African American markets, because prior to that there had not been a big splashy national publication for African Americans prior to Ebony. I know that Hennessy was the first spirit advertiser in both Ebony and Jet. I think it was in 1951 in Ebony and 1953 in Jet. And the first ad was a white man's hand, you know, clutching a bottle of Hennessy. So at that point, this was before Mr. Johnson could actually say, I'm not running an ad unless there's a black person in the ad, which was something that, you know, he was able to do later on, and also something that was so critical to the early days of Essence, that you weren't going to get a Maybelline ad with a white woman. You were only going to see black models, which is not the case anymore, unfortunately, for either publication. But that, you know, some say that Hennessy placing those first ads with us, and every ad was a fight, you know, and if you read Mr. Johnson's autobiography, he talks a lot about, you know, the lengths he went to compel advertisers who did not believe there was a market, or just were very comfortable with the idea that black people need things, we sell things, they'll find us. But that being that a lot of trends in how we spend, today, were created from ads being in Ebony and Jet. And so, and it's funny because now we think of Hennessy as being, you know, like they over-index by like, I think 75% African American market at this point.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I guess what was interesting especially was because I had spent so much time with the earlier African American periodicals, many of which had a really explicitly kind of intellectual perspective. What's funny is the editorial content is not entirely different. There's definitely an overlap in the kinds of issues that are discussed, but the advertisements are completely different. And you know, and to hear my grandmother saying that the advertisements were the appeal. I mean, that was part of the point of getting Ebony. Whereas she had never even heard of the crisis. She had no interest in it. Didn't learn about it until much later. And it was neither affordable nor accessible to her.
I think James Baldwin, someone sent me this quote the other day, it was so deliciously shady, and he said, the crisis has the most interesting talking about, you know, black people, the most fascinating subject matter in the world, and yet it's the most boring magazine you'll ever find.
And you page through issues of the crisis. I had included a few examples in the presentation, but there are, you know, advertisements for pianos, for, you know, NAACP edited Black History editions, you know, like the 15th annual Encyclopedia of Black History.
Like leather-bound volumes?
I'm sorry?
Complete leather-bound volumes?
Not necessarily leather-bound, but definitely hardback volumes that existed in sets of like 40, and you would finish one and then you would subscribe to another, and which, you know, and I know that my parents didn't mention, my father mentioned that the only thing that they subscribed to besides Look and Life and Ebony was Encyclopedia Britannica every year. Yeah.
I was just going to say that when I was browsing the early 20th century periodicals, like when the advertisements were nonetheless amazing and representative, but you were like, oh, if your fraternal organization needs a fez, you'll mail order it to Brooklyn, actually, at this address, and you can get the fezes delivered.
Yeah.
It's like, that is not that big a market, I don't think.
Right.
I think maybe it's worth mentioning that, well, this era, the 50s, was the dawn of mass market, or the dawn of mass media.
Mass marketing.
Yeah, and right, it was also the dawn of scientific or pseudoscientific mass marketing. And I mean, there's this crossover between sociologists and statisticians doing marketing research and doing political research in Poland. But I think beginning in the 30s, but really taking off in the 40s and 50s, you get this incredible amount of data on who Americans are and how to take advantage of who they are, which had not previously been the case. And of course, there was quite a lot of money for academics and other researchers who were doing that kind of work. And so it's not, I mean, there's an integral relationship between the evolution of the media landscape and the evolution of sociological research, especially geared toward consumerism. And these magazines, are in part containers for that research, although in a, obviously they're not publishing academic reports, they're publishing ads for razors, but it's, those two are not so far apart.
Well, and this is the advert, it's like among the different kinds of magazines that you can have, which depends on where the money comes from. There's the subscription model that Jet has or whatever. If you're a mass circulation thing, the content doesn't you actually might even change your frequency because you have too many that it's the advertising that drives the publication, and then you just need content in there so that you can keep having the ads. But there is there's a sense that content is delegitimated today or whatever in the world, but it's that's about mass circulation. Mass circulation has always been agnostic best to content.
Yeah, but I mean, what was interesting about Jet is that it had such a different reason for being, and that it was, that it was really envisioned as a news magazine, like a news aggregator. And one thing that my family had also mentioned actually was how being in Chicago, how much biased or how much coverage of Chicago-related news was present in Jet and Ebony, such that in Jet in particular, such that they would read that to supplement their subscription to the Defender, and that they would find more information that was specifically about Chicago politics, down to the alderman level, that was not necessarily relevant nationally, but that may have been inspirational nationally to especially those who were interested in potentially viewing Chicago as a destination for their sort of migration from the South.
Yeah, I think with Chicago, I'm actually from Chicago, so Ebony and Jet had a different, it's had a special place in my life for many years. It remained that way even until the 90s when we were getting a Jet subscription, just very mundane story about Black Chicago alderperson, or, you notice the over-indexing of Chicago families in the society pages, or but again, Chicago's always had this relationship to Black America as an epicenter of culture, a place where so many of our people came to from the South during the Great Migration. And, because also there's been so much Black leadership in the city of Chicago, there were a lot of political stories to tell there. So it certainly would have been great to see more stories of the South, or the West Coast in particular, which I think really kind of got a raw deal. Most of the issues I've looked over, because I managed to grab a few bound copies of Jet for my, for my personal archives. I noticed this, you don't really talk about California too much. But it's interesting though. I mean, it's, Jet, I think, partially just because of the ways in which media changed from the 80s to now. And also, I think with the Beauty of the Week maybe being the most iconic, if two things are most famous about Jet, one being the size and the other being the Beauty of the Week, I think that the history of Jet is kind of shortchanged a bit as a result. Jet did one of the first post-prison interviews with Angela Davis. There was a lot of coverage of the Black Panther Party and a lot of coverage of social movements from the beginning of the magazine, really until its end. Jet put Jordan Davis on the cover right after he was killed. Jet had meaningful interviews with Trayvon Martin's family. So I do hope that, and this is something I think we struggle with internally a little bit too, but that people will remember it more fondly than we have, because it really was a significant part of who we are, not just as a company, but significant to Black media. And there are a lot of Black writers who cut their teeth at Jet, and a lot of important Black stories that our communities would not have gotten, particularly in the 60s and 70s, if Jet were not around.
Yeah, not to keep talking about my grandmother, but
it's like she's here.
I know. She did. I mean, you know, I don't know. When I was growing up, we subscribed to Ebony. We did not subscribe to Jet, and I think that my parents viewed Ebony as appropriately middle class and Jet as like beneath us. But my grandparents subscribed to Jet, and not only did they subscribe, but as you alluded to, they kept hundreds and hundreds of copies of Jet, which are, you know, they were very small. And my grandmother, she mentioned that what was convenient about them being so small is that she could keep like 300 at hand at a time. But one thing that she mentioned also is that she that from her perspective, she found Ebony to not be as helpful. That for her, she would look to Jet for information about issues that were important, that were politically or socially important to her. She mentioned as an example Jesse Jackson's presidential campaign as something that got huge amounts of attention in Jet, and that was extremely important and significant for Black Americans nationally, but that wasn't taken super seriously in kind of mainstream media, and that she supplemented that with her, you know, her Good Housekeeping and her Better Homes and Gardens, and that those together formed the kind of fabric of her media landscape.
And also, I mean, consider that Jet came out for most of its lifetime once a week. You know, so just the amount of work that goes into putting out a magazine once a week, and the amount of information that you're able to disseminate. So I think that they were maybe 10 days ahead of the news cycle, which is still, I mean, but that they were able to do that 4 times a month is impressive, and that, you know, stories still felt timely because, again, there's no CNN, there's no Fox News, there's no MSNBC at this time. Was very meaningful. I can tell her where to find the Jesse Jackson stories. Since 1984, I've been through the archives. So
Yeah.
I took a couple of those too.
Well, she saved everything that said special edition. She told me that recently she threw out all of her old Jets except for the ones that said special edition, which was still so many boxes.
So did she refer to those issues regularly? I mean, did she tell you that, just because so much of this show seems to suggest that people maintain these personal archives to refer to them in some way on a regular basis, or not, or they are just ever-present objects in one's house?
I think that they were just present as objects. I don't think that I mean, I think that there was, you know, there's always a possibility that it could be used as a reference, and she paid for it, so she's not about to just toss it in the trash, you know, until she has to.
But ultimately, they mark time.
Right, and I don't think that right, exactly, basically. But I don't think that it's not about like maintaining an archive. It's more, you know, she paid for these magazines. She has all these magazines, and she's keeping them until they're like a fire hazard. Then she'll get rid of them.
Not all of them, though. I mean, is that a good way to start talking about the question you had about archives, physical archives, what you can do with them?
I just wonder, how are we on time? Because we could also...
You have a good...
We have a good...
Here's someone as to continue your discussion and we can go for that.
Okay. Well, there was a thought that there is in the same way that there is this transformation that is happening in real time in the delivery of contents. Sorry, I'm totally bungling this question, or this talking point, but it's a talking point, so hopefully something will happen. But there were a number of thoughts that are clustered around the question of the archive, or the idea of the archive. One was actually the degree to which so much of the work here, it's an interesting, somewhat unusual exhibition and sort of idea for an exhibition, where it's like, oh, it's an exhibition about sort of specific art responses to a specific magazine or idea of a magazine or magazine experience, or however you want to say it. But I haven't really seen a similar, I can't think of another, I mean, I guess you could say that your show actually.
No, it's nothing like, because, but you guys, I don't feel like so much of the work actually is archival specifically. I feel like a lot of it incorporates issues of the magazines. That, you know, it's collage that incorporates, you know, Black people, and where do you find Black people in a magazine? In Ebony and Jet, that is where they are. It's not, it's not that Ebony and Jet were, you know, irrelevant to the exhibition, but that they made possible a certain kind of content that was then incorporated into the work. Like, I don't think, I mean, aside from Hank's work, there were a few pieces that were about collecting an archive, and it's true, of course, Jet, because of its size in particular and how the frequency with which it came out, sort of lent itself to that kind of collecting. But I feel that a lot of the work it integrates those magazines, it integrates those images, it includes them as material, like as content, and it's like collage content. In some ways, it's it could be. It's an exhibition of work by mostly Black artists that involves a lot of like Black found magazine images, or is inspired, and those are the magazines. Those are the only ones.
But does it? Does it not seem to? It seems that many of the works intimate a personal relationship with the object itself. Not that someone went into an archive or went online and bought these things the other day in order to make this work, but rather that one's personal experience and memories of these objects within a domestic environment mostly is essential to the work and the impetus for making the work, which maybe is not about the archive, but has a kind of archival sensibility, or at least
I have intimate relationships to all kinds of objects that I would never call archives. I'll leave it at that.
I think I see what you're saying, but I do think of it more as just that something like this could come together because of the unique emotional attachment that African Americans have to these two particular brands, and I think that someone could certainly do something like this with Essence. Perhaps a younger person, maybe someone born, not younger, but maybe someone born between 1975 and 1985 could do something like this with a Vibe magazine. Maybe not as impactful as what you would see with Essence, but I think that what's so special about Ebony and Jet is that for most Black people, this was, if there's just a list of 10 things, Family Feud, 10 things you find in every Black person's house, even if we're not talking about seeing issues from the last couple of years, and I would imagine that for most Black folks of a certain age you will see them, but that we all grew up with Ebony and Jet on some level. When we had to do a school project, we were cutting pictures out of Jet. We weren't cutting them out of Architectural Digest. We weren't cutting them out of People. We weren't cutting them out of Time. We may have been cutting them out of Time. We may have been cutting them out of whatever other publication our parents were reading. But if you were from the South, if you were upper middle class, if you were lower middle class, if you were working class, there was these two things. There was one brand that connected us. And that's Ebony. There's also Fashion Fair, which I should have mentioned earlier, which is the largest, oldest African-American created cosmetics company, which is also interesting. It's an interesting company. We own a cosmetic line. And a big part of the Fashion Fair, and it still exists, and it's still, performing well. It's still very popular around with African-American women, particularly African-American women of a certain age, who can tell you when there was no MAC, and you couldn't go to Lancome, you couldn't go to Chanel, you could get lipstick, you could get nail polish, but you're not going to get foundation in your shade. There's at least one piece downstairs that engages Fashion Fair. I forget what year it was created, but it was also connected to it was the product of the Ebony Fashion Fair traveling show, which was a fashion show that traveled across the country in places like the Apollo Theater, churches, schools, university ballrooms, and it was a huge experience. And Eunice Johnson, who was the wife and co-founder of Johnson Publishing, John Keith Johnson's wife and the co-founder of the company, her passion was beauty and fashion, and she was able to curate this fantastic experience for women who would not be going to Mercedes-Benz Fashion Week at any point, regardless of what year they were born, and bringing couture clothes and designers that did not typically have any need or interest in engaging Black women to essentially to the hood, to the South, to places where we were. And it was splashy and large, and if you've seen a drag show, it was that sort of drama and flair and twirls and turns, and it's, I had the privilege of seeing one of the last ones. It's coming back in some form in the next year or so, but I had the honor of seeing one of the last ones here in the Apollo. I think that was 2008 or 2009, and it was something, and it just kind of speaks to this cultural significance of Ebony and Jet. It's really such an honor to work there. for as challenging as it can be to kind of navigate who I am as a professional and as a writer and some of the things that I stand for, and just the, if I'm slipping, it's not just, oh, don't you work for a magazine, you have to represent the magazine, but just like, my grandmother, my great-grandmother, how could you, like when Nene Leakes from Real Housewives of Atlanta was on the cover, I guess that was 2012, and I, at the time, was running Ebony's social media accounts. That was a very difficult few weeks for me because that was a very polarizing cover. Older people were not happy at all. And that's a whole other conversation about like who gets to be on the cover of Ebony and what's appropriate. And this is a magazine that shot Dr. King and Betty Shabazz and Louis Armstrong and Muhammad Ali. So to now be in the 2000s and have Nene Leakes or T.I. and Tiny and people like that, and what does it mean for the culture? What does it mean for the publication? But to have to receive that sort of feedback and phone calls and the amount of people who are just horrified.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, one of the things that I'm thinking about also with relation to what you're saying is how maybe one of the things that's unique also about Ebony and Jet is that while they're ubiquitous in Black households, I don't know that other households really encounter them. Is that true?
I probably shouldn't answer that. No. What were you going to say?
Well, when I was doing some homework or whatever, there was a claim that at a certain point that the two most distinct audiences for magazines were Country Living, which is 99% white, and Ebony, which is 99% African American. But I don't know if that's true.
I don't know if it's true.
I suspect it's not true, but it's a nice contrast.
I think, well, for us, it's probably true. I'd say that, but what's interesting, and I don't have the most recent numbers, but we did some research on our online audience and found that it was surprisingly diverse to the tune of 20-30% not African, not Black. That we had a lot of international readers who were not necessarily Black either, some that, of course, were. I think that's because some of the writers who we have brought with them their own followings, and some of them have been writing for progressive liberal publications on other sides of the internet before, so they followed them to us. We've had our most popular story to date, well, three most popular. I don't know which one is number one at this point because they still traffic after quite a while. There was a story after Dave Chappelle had the alleged meltdown at the comedy show. That just surprisingly blew up from somebody who'd been in the audience and watched it happen and defended him. And then we had two stories about rape by Zerlina Maxwell. One was Stop Telling Women How Not to Get Raped. And the other one, I forget the name of, but our stories like that for us, particularly women's interest stories, are huge. So that has connected us with an audience of women of other races and men of other races and a whole lot of trolls, which I'm like, that's traffic too. So if you want to come here and tell us we're terrible Black monkeys, our advertisers don't know that you came here because you made us. So keep coming and telling us that.
Are the web and the magazine, do they have similar publics?
No. The magazine, I think, and you probably came across this in your research, was the age 37? Is that still?
I think it said chiefly millennials.
No.
I was looking at
that's the .com.
Yeah, the average age is like 41 or 40. Okay. Yeah, it's like 40 point something.
Okay, yeah, that sounds more reasonable. I know one point was supposed to be 37. I was like, about 37 maybe. But online we definitely seem to have a more millennial audience. So, we're not really grabbing too many college students at this point, but, younger people, young professionals.
Yeah. I'm also wondering, in terms of the kind of share of African American audience, just because I do think that going back to Alex's kind of question at the beginning, relating to some of the different reasons that artists choose to use Ebony and Jet objects as starting points for artworks, and the intimacy of the kind of relationship with those objects is one thing, the availability, accessibility of of the objects as archives, like as aggregates, as another thing. And I'm also wondering whether some of those materials whether there's maybe something interesting about how some of those materials are really comfortable and familiar to Black artists and their families, but maybe less familiar to the kind of broader art community or context. I'm just not sure. I don't know. My own relationship with Ebony is very. It's when I think about Ebony and Jet, I think about relationships that are, family relationships, intimate, domestic contexts, and not necessarily. I haven't even thought very much about Ebony and Jet since high school, since I left home, to be honest.
Yeah.
But
I mean, you can. It's not like that sense of familiarity is so specific.
No,
I mean,
no.
like so many people have these kinds of relationships with. I mean, people our age. I'm not sure about people 5 or 10 years younger. Have that kind of intense emotional relationship with the objects that surrounded them in their youths, especially like the magazines that delivered information they had never encountered before. I'm like embarrassed to say what those magazines are for me, but like Mike's experiences are
Wait, what
more
are the
relevant.
magazines?
No, I was just reading like skateboarding and guitar magazines when I was 12 or something. But yeah, that was. Well, also, no, what was I?
Like Blacktail or?
Yeah, I wasn't very sophisticated as a 12-year-old, unfortunately. No, I mean, although I do remember like picking up The Nation for the first time when I was probably that same age, 12 or something, and being shocked and delighted, but also not really knowing how to negotiate my experience with this magazine and whatever world it represented, which I had not known to exist previously. And yeah, I mean, that's like pretty much a container for a certain kind of information. There isn't much of a cultural sensibility. There's certain, I mean, there is, but it's not one like I was desperate to identify with. But
right.
The
So
imagery and marketing is really bad in The Nation.
Yes.
That's not
yeah,
really
I mean the
full
skateboarding magazines are
figures.
much better at that because that's of course that's what they're trying to do is seduce you through imagery.
Right, but there are exhibitions about things like surfing, and maybe Ebony Jet or exhibition bears more of a family resemblance to that kind of thing. Like maybe it has to do with it's a cultural product that's shared among some people. Rather than it being that it's the magazine specifically. Like we might not ever find an analogy in U.S. News and World Report. There's not going to be an exhibition at the Guggenheim next year that's like.
The glory days of U.S. World.
Exactly.
I mean, I think that we do need to go to questions in a second. I had something which I think actually though, even as I think it invites maybe. It's not the right thing, but I do find when I was thinking about the archive, what I meant by it in a way where I was going to go was that to me the interesting question of like, insofar as part of what people feel is nostalgia for family, for youth, for domesticity, for what you had before you left home, or like this kind of context. When you don't have physical magazines anymore, when you get all of your content delivered online, what will you be nostalgic? What will there be an object that becomes totemic for you, or like how will that work, and how will that filter into creating new aesthetic experiences?
Hopefully, nostalgia will no longer exist because we'll film every single moment of our lives.
I saw that episode.
Or we'll find out that someone has recorded an archive of everything.
Right. I saw because I'm working a little bit on a biography. I kept thinking like, is the ultimate destiny of all this NSA wiretapping to give people, since nobody writes letters to anybody anymore or whatever, it's like all you're going to have are conversations that someone tape recorded without you knowing it. That would be good for biographers, if for no one else. But I actually did have a question, which is and this is sort of related still to the like. The not yet resolved question of print and digital, and actually I was saying that when I was sort of on the Ebony website, I couldn't tell if much of the content that I was seeing was from the magazine, whether it was like a digital version of the magazine, or I mean, and I now know more that it is very much its own thing, but it's an interesting, if Ebony went out of business, I'd be like, no, that website has all this new stuff. Like, and I'm curious about how the money works in a way. Like, does the physical magazines support, like, are each of them independent do they pay people the same? I'm like in terms of the mechanics of how that culture is generated.
So we're one company. We have separate budgets, different mastheads, different editors, different writers. Occasionally you'll see a byline from print that pops up on the website or vice versa. Digital does not pay as much for writing as print does. That's universal. There are very few unless you're like Ta-Nehisi, you're not getting print money to write on the internet. Like, it just doesn't happen. I think our rates are pretty much on par with what people are paying in the industry at this point. We're just separate. We're siblings, but we're not twins. I don't think that, we do repurpose some of the magazine content occasionally. We'll put a cover story up to, just because something buzzy has happened with the person in question, or, like the Pharrell cover story ended up on the web because people started talking about it a few weeks after it went off newsstands. We do repurpose some of the stories that we either think are really strong, that we just think deserve more life than they got on the newsstand. We're making the conscious decision now to lean a little bit more on the print magazine, but it's like, if you can get the whole magazine on the internet, what's the point of buying the magazine? I think that we've been able to curate two separate experiences that are alike in certain ways and different in others. I hope that, in the future, maybe we'll work a little bit more closely together. Maybe one day there'll be one masthead. I think that'd be a good destination for us, but that's not where we are right now. So different advertisers occasionally. When I first started with the site, and we have a completely different a sales department at this point, but a lot of ads that appeared on the web were marketed as extra added value, which means if you buy this, I'll throw this in. And I think that it kind of spoke to not just our particular publication, but just kind of an industry attitude around print versus digital, But for people who kind of are living in the future or are living in the present day, kind of understand that, like, something that happens digitally, one, it can be shared in so many ways. So I write something and you like it and you send it to 20 of your friends instantly, and 7 of them go to the website and look at it. You've got 7 more eyes on your advertisement, as opposed to, I bought the magazine, it's in my house, maybe somebody comes and sees it, maybe they don't. It's just, it feels like a no-brainer, but it's something that both the magazine and the advertisers are struggling to kind of keep up with. The idea that, maybe this is where we should be spending all of our money. And we're seeing advertisers who traditionally were very print-heavy now saying maybe we should be spending more of our money on the internet, because that's where we're going to reach more people.
So, yes, I think we'd like to take any questions that you have, if they exist.
So if you have questions, feel free to just ask it out.
I have a couple of questions, but I'll just start with one. This ties in with what you were saying about how, now that everything is digital, how will we be nostalgic? My question is, for all of you, what do you see for the future in terms of passively encountering things? One thing I always thought was interesting was that I got insight into who my grandmother was because she had the stack of Ebony and the stack of Jet. And so even when my mother's subscription lapsed, I would be able to passively encounter it. But now if everything is heavily curated, right, you only see what your friends post. Usually your friends are like you. You unfollow people who don't post anything you don't like, who post anything you don't like. What do you see for the future in terms of encountering things that don't speak to your everyday perception of self, but that you were able to passively encounter? Trademark.
I think I may have had $1 million idea of how that can work, so I'm afraid to say it. But maybe at some point there'll be a move toward publishing the web's best writing. And I know that there are certainly collections of, or the web's best moments in some sort of way that you can keep. And I know that there are collections and lists every year that exist, but again, it's like it requires you to click on, and to experience it digitally in the way that you encountered it. So maybe it's worth taking some of the best of the internet and finding some way to archive it in a physical way. Because again, it's not even just experiencing it at your grandmother's house while she's still alive. It's cleaning out your grandmother's things when she passes away, or this box of things from your great-grandmother that your mom gives to you. That now, when you mention that, like how we, on one hand, it's like, okay, we'll be able to revisit our own things, because if I think about crisscross, like, oh man, crisscross is such a big part of my, being a little girl, I can Google them. I can pull up their music and listen to it in real time. but I can't experience them in the way that I did when when they were out. And also, it requires me to go looking for them as opposed to just kind of haphazardly encountering them. And I think that the only thing that, unless we start printing these things out in books, and I think books about the web will be a fascinating and important thing in the future. We'll just be stumbling upon devices, just be, oh, I still have my iPod 1. I still have my, what? I'm thinking about the way, like, when you said you would stumble upon magazines, it's like.
I was wondering if it would work.
Aren't there services that enable you to print your individualized social media streams? Like they package them into a book?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how popular they are.
I don't think
but,
I
yeah.
You sent it. I'm thinking about like when you go to a doctor's office, you get that receptionist take on the world, right? And that their curation in a way, and it can be someone totally unlike you. When you go to someone else's home, you're getting their magazine spread in a way that I don't know how else we're going to get that in the digital world, because we curate who we so heavily edit what we allow into our monitor or our screen space.
I mean, what you're going to, this is really morbid, but I've spent a lot of time encountering stuff, freighted stuff, but it's like, part of the thing is that you're going to find your grandmother's hard drive. And there's going to be stuff, there are going to be, in the increasingly digital context, there's still going to be traces of specificity that are going to be, then you're going to be like, oh wow, what was that? I mean, it's going to require, it's not fully passive, but it's not as directed. There are traces, and it's what you need is a trace to follow.
But I mean, this connects to the question you were asking as well, what will we do in a world without these objects? I mean, my sense is that people would be nostalgic for the experiences had by previous generations with these objects because they can be recognized visually. I mean, they seem palpable in a way that a future in which we have not had meaningful experiences with these objects that accumulate and can be used to track time and relationships and so on seems not to offer. But I don't know, I mean, I'm sure someone will invent a way to do that to make money, but perhaps not. But yeah, I don't know, it's like a horrifying scenario kind of, right? Like a world without any associations with any physical objects, which also means it's like you leave no traces, except for all the digital traces, but those are really controlled.
I feel like you had
and I feel like we forget about the objecthood of the internet and digital objects, right? Because if we found our grandmother's floppy disk, we wouldn't have anything to read it with, and so that's all kind of gone in the same in a way that's very different from finding a book, which you can always access the contents if you know how to read.
Well, Well, I was just a tiny point about this, which is, I have a friend who's actually an archivist of outmoded media, but there's constantly more and more media that are outmoded, So it's and at this particular moment in time, in an art context, it's video. The first generation, video art, as video art comes into existence as a thing, as videotapes that stick around, as opposed to, even at the beginning, video isn't being recorded, it's actually being experienced in real time. It's like making music visually. As it's being recorded, we're losing the ability to listen to those things. And it's not even because the tape is degrading, it's because the machines that can play them are going, and the people who know how to fix them, it's you could maybe spend $1 million to reverse engineer the thing later, but it's disappearing. So there is this kind of marooning of stuff. So his thing, certainly for internet stuff, is as an archivist, he's your grandparents were right. You should print, if the email is worth keeping, you should print it out, because that's the only, paper is still the most reliable.
And so much of them, do you want to go ahead?
Well, I mean, I don't know if what I'm saying is more important than what you're saying, but
I'll say mine afterwards, and then we can judge.
Okay. Well, I was just going to say that that when in conversation with those kinds of archivists, it seems to me that there are a set of well-established procedures for envisioning the future life of, first of all, for determining the the archival nature of any current medium and then and determining the best way to kind of preserve the future life of that thing. And it seems, I mean, I just wonder, as one possibility for what will happen in the future, is that perhaps we'll become better attuned to the need to manage our digital archives, which right now none of us pay any attention to, but which there are established methods for doing it. Many of the media that we use, while they do become outdated, they're also pretty consistent. You know, if your images are in JPEG form or camera raw form, or if your emails have an EMLX extension, then you know those are media that are commonly shared, and that the updating of which, or the archivability of which, can be easily standardized. Right now the public doesn't pay. No one has sort of monetized that standardization or paid attention to sort of marketing it or forcing people to think about it. But yeah.
I mean, it's right. It's still onerous and expensive, and essentially requires an expert. I mean, it helps if that person has an advanced degree in archiving. I mean, we've been dealing with this at Triple Canopy since the very beginning, when we started with the knowledge that whatever we did online would become obsolete almost immediately. Every time the browser updated, initially we had to search the website and change a number of things, and now we're working with an institutional archive to figure out how best to approach archiving all of the work we've done digitally, which means everything we've published online, but also all of the data we have that does not exist in published form. And yeah, there are best practices, but they involve numerous approaches undertaken simultaneously: preserving hardware, preserving software, preserving data, metadata, preserving machines that can run the same way.
Right. I mean, that's absolutely true.
Right.
But I mean, right now most people's digital lives involve consumer products that are widely shared. It's a little bit different from what you guys use, which are proprietary, not back end, but at least the appearance of the content is specific to you. I mean, I'm just saying that just in the same way that, for example, right now, if I wanted to update, if I had a Super 8 film and I wanted to convert it to a QuickTime file, I would easily be able to do that because there's a huge.
Yeah, that kind of basic transcoding is not complicated. It's not so complicated, but I mean, that's the kind of archiving that most individuals require. But I'm just saying, there's this whole vast world of media beyond that basic kind of media. I mean, and what we've been doing is creating a book every year that essentially archives all our activities in print, because it's cheap and it's effective, and it's a thing you can hold, and it has its own. I mean, it's a book experience, which is pleasurable.
Any other questions?
A lot of the publications we looked at arose during periods of political or social upheaval, and I'm just wondering now if given recent events, particularly the shootings, are you seeing examples of magazines or even opportunities for publications to come into being?
Like the creation of new publications?
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think that what we have yet to see, online in particular, I don't know that right now is in terms of thinking about social movements and what's happening in the country and across the world, if investing in a new print publication could adequately take any of that on, unless we're just going to be waxing poetic and who can write the prettiest words about, what's happening, because you're not going to be able to print something once a week, so you're not updating people, and even if it were once a week, you're not updating people on the news at this point. But if someone were able to create a website that really managed to engage the need for particularly young people to emote, reflect, learn about what's going on in the world right now in a way that is unapologetic, I haven't seen that. I'm a big fan of color lines. First of all, I'll say we do what we can. We do all that we can with small resources, small team, small staff of writers. Color Lines does really fantastic work around race and social justice. But somebody who can really find the intersection, there's lots, I mean, Complex had cameras on West Florissant, and Gawker has some really great essays about things that are going on. So it's not that the work is not being done, you know, it's just that pieces of the work are being done across the internet. But I certainly think that there's an opportunity for somebody who can kind of find that intersection of social consciousness with a slight dash of pop culture, because it's kind of hard to remove that, particularly when you're trying to engage younger people. But I think the doors are wide open right now, and somebody's going to do it any second now, and I'm going to be mad, and it's going to be every idea I've ever thrown out in every meeting, like, you know, imagine if we had the budget to do X, Y, and Z. I'm like, oh, we do all this, and then next week somebody will do it. So, but I do think we will see a number of new publications emerging. And we will see some existing publications, and I know this from certain conversations that I've had, that are going to take on social justice in a far more meaningful way in the months to come. This I know for a fact.
I have a question. Does Ebony does the digital team kind of feel the pressure of being like the leading voice since like 1945? And also, sort of, what are the expectations that you may personally have of other like publications of color about issues like Ferguson, etc.?
Is this being live streamed or just videotaped? It's live streaming? Okay. Certainly feel the pressure of a historical brand, of something that people haven't, you know, whether they read it every month or only grew up with it on the coffee table or in the dentist office. You know, again, some of the mistakes or decisions that I can make as a writer and editor, or that we can make as a team, that I can make at Jezebel or even at the Griot, I can't make with Ebony without consequences. I could certainly write for even The Atlantic and get into a Twitter debate with, you know, somebody from the Republican Party and not have, you know, that wouldn't be an opportunity for someone to say, you're discounting the voice and the opinion of every Black conservative that ever existed because you work for Ebony, and thus you are beholden to all Black people, and you have to not only respect all Black opinions, you have to uplift them and somehow be in agreement with all of them.
Sounds really hard.
It is really hard. It's really hard. One day I will write about this. So that there's pressure there. There's pressure to be exciting and engaging, and you know, I think that we've responded well. We've been bold. We've made decisions that a print magazine simply could not make. We've done things that I don't think our sister publication could get away with if they wanted to. You know, there's also the pressure of, if people think of Ebony and Jet as being old, you know, how do we compel an audience that was not interested in us because we were a magazine? Not even just because they had a negative view of the magazine, but just because they don't read magazines, you know, or they don't read things that their parents read. You know, so the difference between us and, say, a Vibe is that Vibe is still fairly young. It was created in the 90s, so even if people, you know, may have some thoughts on the quality of Vibe today versus Vibe when it launched in, it was 92, 93, it wasn't their parents' magazine. You know, maybe it was their parents' magazine, depending on how young they were, but it wasn't their grandparents' magazine, their great-grandparents' magazine, you know, so there isn't that kind of weight of history around their neck, good, bad, or otherwise. The second part of your question was other...
Sort of what expectations do you have or do you not have of other, like, Black publications about issues like Ferguson, or, you know, how do you kind of look at their coverage as opposed to your coverage?
I'll say this. I was the only person from thinking of magazines and large mainstream websites. I was the only person I saw in Ferguson, with the exception of somebody who was a local correspondent, I think, for News One. So to now see Essence do a Black Lives Matter cover, I really tip my hat to them. And I also know that that came from somewhere. You know, we've been giving, you know, what we've done online, I think in a lot of ways, we've given people some inspiration. That's not a bad thing. It's not about being in constant competition with Essence or the Griot or Root or anybody else. But I do think that some of the choices we've made have inspired other people in terms of their coverage, particularly of social justice, of reproductive rights. You know, to see an Essence article on Roe v. Wade today written by somebody who really had a platform already, but really built up her cachet as a writer on Ebony.com to now be writing for Essence.com and Essence Magazine. It's not on accident, you know. I hope that we see more. You know, I would love to go to brass at the magazine and say, we have to be more radical, we have to be more bold because everyone's doing it now. You know, we can't be afraid right now. We can't be so shaken by advertisers. Now is the time to be bold. Now is the time to be unapologetically Black. Because everyone else is doing it. You know, Vice is, I mean, they're doing some great stuff and they're doing some stuff that's like, what? You know, horribly offensive, but they're doing edgy, provocative, and sometimes very thoughtful things around race, and Gawker is doing it, and Complex is trying it sometimes, and you know, now is not the time for apologetic or polite conversations on race. And when any brand has attempted to do that, any Black brand has attempted to do that, it's failed. But I think that when we've been bold and thoughtful around it, which is something that's easier to do online than it is in print, we've done well. If you look at some of those Ebony magazines from the 60s and 70s, and they have covers like, you know, Which Way Black America, Integration, Liberation, you know, the Black Revolution, and, you know, the coverage of the Panthers and of Dr. King, and the Radical King, not just the sanitize, you know, they weren't sanitizing him back then. Back then he was the enemy of the state, you know. I think that's our history and our legacy, and I think that's who we need to be right now more than ever. And if that's not who we are right now, then, you know, then this chapter will end soon.
One more question, although that sounded like a really good way to end, actually. But
Yeah.
I don't want to over-curate things, so if you have a question.
Told you I had a lot.
Yeah.
So, totally different than anything that was discussed, but based on something Jamilah brought up about Fashion Fair, which was a publication created a commercial product born out of a need that its readership expressed. Do you think that that's something that could be replicated in the 21st century by digital publication or otherwise?
Yes, absolutely. You know, I mean, especially just considering the amount of almost free advertising a publication will have at this point. So Fashion Fair comes about at a point where Ebony was doing things like having, you know, say your church is participating in the subscription sale. So the person who sells the most Ebony subscriptions gets to be, it was like Miss Ebony or something. It was some title you would get, you know, and you get your picture in the magazine and you'd win some. So I think it was like a Tupperware set or some very like of that moment prize that you could win for selling the most subscriptions in your church or your community. So the Fashion Fair was able to do as well as it has at a time where I don't think there have ever been television ads for Fashion Fair, and for many years they did not even advertise in Essence magazine because they were considered a competitor. Now, if somebody were to sell something on a website that conceivably, I go to my favorite websites every single day. You know, yes, I think it could happen. I don't know what that product is, you know, because the difference, you know, what makes Fashion Fair so different from some of the other products that we use was what you said, necessity. So now I have 100 different makeup options, and you know, Fashion Fair is in my makeup kit because, you know, one, I work for the company that makes it, and two, it's good quality makeup. If somebody can find something that, you know, you can't get anywhere else and you're selling it on the internet every day, I think that's a pretty winning model. What product would you think of? Is there anything that came to mind, like?
This is recorded, so we'll talk. No, I think the curiosity too is that Ebony is a niche publication, and niche publications don't really exist in the same way, especially around things like hair texture, skin color, and that has also been addressed in a lot of, you know, corporations. L'Oreal got their hands on Carol's Dog. Everybody wants to thinking of how they can address the unaddressed, if for no other reason in capitalism. But it's just a curious. I'm just fascinated by Ebony's position as a cultural producer. Producer, I mean like literally producing commercial products at Fashion Fair, show experience and also the cosmetics. So I was just
But there are other, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just Vice essentially, that company primarily produces commercial products. I mean, they take the form of experiences for clients, but you know, that is Vice's model.
Yeah.
And it's, I think, increasingly a popular model.
Yeah. No, even today, actually, after our conversation yesterday, I was looking at the media kit for Black Enterprise and realizing just how much of their income comes from these conferences that they organize. Like producing events is an important part of their income stream, and entirely independent. And in addition, they also have a hedge fund, like an index fund that invests exclusively in Black-owned businesses, and it's worth like $90 million. So they have like multiple products that supplement the magazine. The magazine is just one. The print magazine is one thing. The web is an entirely other thing. Just, you know, as you were describing, a totally separate income stream, separate budget, and then they have all these other things too.
The same with Essence, as you know. Essence Festival makes a whole lot more money than Essence Magazine.
Yeah, I was thinking about that too.
So we should all start our own funds.
Not everybody wins. But I also I think that there actually is, part of it is that I do think it's like tech and capitalism driven or whatever. So even like sort of makeup, like it's sort of, in the 50s, it's marketing also color. Like there's just like this kind of era in which that's like a really good pitch. And I feel like there's a lot of stuff that's already happening. I mean, if you think about like the way that The Root even was also a way of selling DNA like kits or whatever to know your genealogy, it's like there's going to be a lot of genetic marketing, like, which is not going to be, you know, like something, it's like we now know something about you. Like we used to know everybody who read, like you were able to find out who your audience was, like you're going to be able to create new audiences with new information. And people are going to find opportunities.
We can genetically engineer our audiences?
You're going to genetically engineer the same product. You're going to convince someone that they need it for a particular reason that they didn't know before, I think. But thank you, everybody, for coming.